Now, the protests against Israel's genocide continued this Saturday. There is, of course, the respite of the ceasefire, but the killings were and are going on. And clearly, those who believe Netanyahu and Trump and those around them are going to allow the Palestinian people to live in peace and justice, I'm afraid, are going to collide with a brutal reality. Nonetheless, there was an attempt by the police to shut down the protests outside the BBC. That attempt was successful. And that protest, which I was attending, as is my brilliant guest here, was about the BBC's coverage of the genocide. I wrote a very long investigative piece for Dropsite News, and the point I would make is the claims about the BBC's coverage are made not least by the BBC's own journalists. So, in a democratic country, people want to protest what is the public broadcaster which we fund with our license fees. The police stopped that for reasons we will discuss, and then I'd say some pretty shocking developments took place, which were consistent with the Metropolitan Police's tradition of, I think, dishonesty is being kind. I'm really glad to be joined by Zack Polanski, who's the deputy leader of the Green Party of England and Wales, but also is represented on the Greater London Assembly. So, Zack, how you doing? Great to see you.
I'm good. Thanks for having me, as always, Owen.
So we were both at this protest. Can we just firstly start with, I guess, the premise, which was why the police intervened to stop the protest happening and then had a broader crackdown, which is that this is essentially, they say, disruption to the Jewish community. There was which is, I guess, translated as somehow menacing towards the Jewish community. There were no synagogues on the route. There was a synagogue near the BBC. Do you want to just tell me about this and what you think, as someone who is obviously an elected politician and a proud British Jew, I suppose?
I think it's as simple as this is the establishment protecting itself. We have a government who has been complicit in arming a genocide. We have major opposition parties that have also fueled that genocide. And so when it comes to a group of people who are representative of lots of people in this country who don't want to see the mass murder of innocent civilians, who don't want to see Netanyahu supported by our government, want to assemble, that is a real threat to the establishment, because that's essentially the facade of democracy that we have in this country crumbling, because this is demonstrating that where the government are at, and even where the major opposition party are at, is in a completely different place to where the British public are at. And so I think that is the first thing, that the Prime Minister, the Home Secretary, the police more widely, that whole blob of institutions go, this protest, these people need to be stopped. Now, within that, of course, Jewish voices like myself, but many Jews who are speaking out against this are a particular threat, because what they have chosen to do is try and weaponize people's identity, people's Judaism, and claim that this is some sort of threat to Jewish people. Now, we've got to be careful here. There is a distinction to be made. There are some Jewish people, and I know Jewish people, who are intimidated by these protests. That doesn't mean they should be intimidated by these protests. That doesn't mean the protests should stop because they're intimidated. But I think it is also true that the police and the government have chosen to inflate those fears, to stir those fears, and to center those fears, because it all, again, serves the purpose of making this threat to the establishment even more of a threat that then is combined with anti-Semitism. Now, we know anti-Semitism exists, as anti-Muslim or Islamophobia, hate exists, and it's really important that we tackle that and we stand together with those communities. You do not tackle anti-Semitism by supporting a murderous Israeli government. You do not tackle anti-Semitism by turning on British Jews and claiming that we are in some way not Jewish because we hold a different position on the Israeli state. And you don't tackle anti-Semitism by stoking further division. So I think all of these issues have been put into one complete mess by the police and the Home Secretary. But ultimately, we need to be really clear what was going on here. This was about a group of citizens, yes, elected politicians like myself, Jeremy Corbyn, John McDonnell, journalists like yourself, Owen, cultural icons like Juliet Stevenson, lots of civil group leaders, community leaders, all peaceful, coming together with thousands of members of the public, much more representative and much broader base, and saying, we will gather together peacefully to stand for peace. And have been met by police resistance that has been, we've got some questions about it, but presumably been given instructions from higher up. And I think that's deeply serious for our democracy.
I mean, just on that, in terms of the broader point about the protests, the arrest rate is lower than at Glastonbury Music Festival, for example. And it's striking that actually, I mean, I'm interested in your thoughts on this. There's actually a kind of quite a racist narrative, which sprung out of that, because there was an attempt then to square the claims of Suella Braverman and the likes that these are hate marches with the lack of arrests. So Suella Braverman came up with a formulation, which she wrote in the Telegraph, saying Islamists are in charge of Britain and the police are under the thumb of Islamists. And it was this, what the kind of can zone in on are these protests have angry Muslims, quote unquote, who are kind of extreme and all the rest of it. I mean, that's what this became, didn't it? And that's how that is an important part of this narrative.
Yeah, I was going to say there's always been a racist undertone to criticism of Palestinian solidarity, but it's not even an undertone anymore. I do think it is blatant racism at this point. They're not even trying to hide the facade of this being respectable. And I think this comes to a wider point as well, which is around the dangers of centrism, of the dangers of Starmer's government that paints itself as centrist, but I would argue is certainly to the right of centre, if not quite far away to the right of centre, certainly further, arguably, than even David Cameron's government. And I think what this all does, and I'm aware even in this interview and every time I talk about this, is creating a huge open space for Nigel Farage, because we know trust of the police is already really low. We know trust of government and our elected institutions is also really low. And so when speaking in the tone that I am, I'm further eroding the trust, because trust needs to be eroded. We cannot trust these institutions at the moment with the people who run them. But if we don't create a credible alternative that gives people hope and that has a tangible difference to that alternative, what Keir Starmer is doing is rolling out the red carpet to the fascists. And we've seen that play out straight away in America with Biden and Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. And I would even say, someone like AOC, someone who I've respected for a long time, she did not need to get up on stage at the Democratic conference and say Joe Biden is working tirelessly every day for a ceasefire. That is something that is demonstrably not true. And we're seeing the same thing under Keir Starmer. We're seeing him go out of his way to protect this Israeli government, no matter what they do. We had him say that Israel had the right to turn off or water and electricity. He said that's not what he meant, but just a few hours, Emily Thornberry went out on TV and radio to double down on what he said and was rewarded by being kicked out of the cabinet. All of that aside, all of that is a sideshow essentially to the fact that people are dying, innocent people are dying, and Nigel Farage is rubbing his hands with glee because all of this is playing into this general sense that we cannot trust in democratic institutions anymore. And so he is there and ready to pick up that mantle. And I think it's so important that anyone who considers themselves on the left, and that is a broad spectrum, comes together and says this cannot happen. But actually, ultimately, the number one thing we need to do at the moment is hold this Labour government to account. They cannot continue to pretend that they are standing up for respectability and decency at the same time that they are defending a police force that frankly have been caught lying. And I don't think we should fudge it any other than that.
I was going to come on to that. I mean, just the broader point, the again, no synagogues on the route itself, the proposed route, which obviously didn't happen. The synagogue nearby, its services ended at 1 p.m. and the protest outside the BBC was due to arrive at 3 p.m, 2 hours later, just as broader context. And also just that point about the Metropolitan Police. I mean, they were found, they're supposed to be upholding community cohesion here. That's their claim. They were found by a government report to be institutionally racist, sexist, homophobic, and corrupt. I mean, with that in mind, what we were told then, because what was then proposed, because I turned up, when I turned up to this protest, it was ridiculous. It was absolutely ridiculous. I was walking through Whitehall, aggressive police lines everywhere, preventing people from moving anywhere. It was made a static protest. People couldn't get towards the stage where the speeches were. I only got let through because I was a member of the press. Then what was proposed by Ben Jamal, who's directed the Palestine Solidarity Campaign, who I've interviewed prior to this, who's now been charged, I should say, we'll come on to that, is that instead of this protest, which has now been banned, they would walk with flowers to remember the dead slaughtered Palestinian children. And they would walk through, but if the police stopped them, then they would simply lay the flowers on the floor. What happened? Zach, just what happened?
Yeah, so first of all, the exact same experience of arriving at the protest and feeling the aggression that was coming from the police. I'd only been there about 30 seconds when I actually had a conversation with a police officer because a woman, I don't know how old she was, but I would guess late 60s, early 70s, was trying to get out of the protest to go to the toilet. The police officer was saying that she was now in the protest and she couldn't get out. She was going to have to walk a very long way round. To be fair to the police officer, I said, what do you think she's going to do? And looked at her. And they then actually did let her out. But it shouldn't have required someone to be there to talk about common sense. And it just, reflecting on it, if the police are there to protect Londoners and protect the public, how are you protecting the public if someone who is older, who wants to get out of that protest, who is clearly not any threat and saying that they need to use the toilet, is then not able to use the toilet? That is clearly the police not doing their job. More widely, though, at the end of the protest, Ben Jamal came on stage and talked about the aggressive and authoritarian attitude that the police had towards this protest. And I think it's important, first of all, to mark that point. I spoke to people at the protest, one of my good friends, in fact, whose parents are often at those protests. I said to him, are your parents around? And he said, no, they saw all the stuff online and just didn't fancy being kettled by police for a couple of hours. And I think that's an important point to note, that is already a suppression tactic. Just all the conversation that was in the media and the kind of social media is more widely designed to send the message to the wider public to say, you can't come to these protests because if you do, it is dangerous, so you may be arrested, and you do not have your democratic right to arrive. So you're already creating a higher bar for people to be able to exercise their democratic and free right than they should be able to. So that was already problematic. Second thing, Ben Jamal comes on stage and gives a very excellent and calm speech and just says, we have been banned from marching. We're not going to march. What we are going to do in this small delegation is to walk forward with flowers up until the point that the police stop us, when we will stop and lay the flowers for the dead. There was a very moving moment, one of the most moving moments I've had at a protest recently, where we're on the stage and he turned to the sizable crowd and said, could you part ways for the delegation to step forward? Because it's a peaceful protest and people were very attentive. There was this amazing parting of the ways as then people were allowed to walk through very slowly with the flowers in silence. This was not a threatening moment. This was not an aggressive moment. This could not have been more peaceful and more somber with the kind of nature that you would expect, which is ultimately to mourn the destruction and devastation of people's lives. Walked forward with the flowers. Now, admittedly, at this moment, I was at the front. I very consciously, I could feel that people were coming forward, many of whom I presume were Muslim or were wearing headscarves. And I felt it was important that they were able to come forward for the media to be able to be at the front and represent the people that they were representing. So I was still very near the front, but I wasn't exactly at the front. We then reached the point of the police line where I presume we were going to stop, and the flowers were laid down. We stopped there for about 2 minutes. Still in silence, and then the police started to let us through, and in fact were saying, and there is video evidence of this, come through. So by that point we're being allowed into Trafalgar Square. Now, admittedly, I found this odd. I thought the whole point was that we were walking up until the police stopped us, laying the flowers, but they did not stop us. They did not ask us to lay the flowers. They continued to let us come into Trafalgar Square. Now, I then, hours later, see on the Metropolitan Police's Twitter feed that they're saying the marchers in some way forced their way through. That is categorically not true. And in fact, I tweeted that before I knew that there was evidence that it wasn't true, because I believed it was important enough to be able to use our voice, yes, as elected representatives, but also just frankly as people who were there to say what the Metropolitan Police are saying is not true. It then turned out there was video evidence that backed everything that I was saying, and indeed Jeremy and John and everyone who was there was saying. And today I've just written to the Home Secretary in my capacity as a London Assembly member, asking her to review the body-worn cameras of the police, to retract the statements that she has made and the police has made, and indeed to apologise. I think all of those things are necessary in order to move forward on this. Yes, trust is low on the police, but I don't think it helps us to erode it even further or to dismiss the need for trust with the police. There is a long way to go to build that trust with the police, particularly, it should be said, for minority communities. And I think a step forward in doing that amongst a much bigger body of work, which is a much bigger conversation, is to tell the truth. That has to be the most basic capacity. And now there is very clear evidence. It's important, yes, the Home Secretary has egg on her face on this, But the best thing she could do at this point is clarify, admit she got it wrong and she spoke too soon, and talk about where we go in the future to make sure that people can assemble freely. And by the way, this is not just about Palestine. We've seen this with climate protests. We will see this more and more with trade union movements, with civil rights movements. And it is vital that everyone, no matter where they stand on the Palestinian issue, no matter where they stand on any issue, understand how important and dangerous this moment is for our democracy, for our future. And frankly, the entire country should be getting round to say, no matter what you believe on any subject, if we want to maintain the democracy that we've proudly had in this country, and yes, caveat, although we say there's been democracy, there have always been problems with the police, always been problems, particularly for minority communities. But let's at least hold on to what we have and improve it, rather than allowing it to be completely shattered.
Amen. I mean, just lastly, well, I should say the Metropolitan Police have a record of, when I say dishonesty, in about, frankly, much graver issues. For example, the death of Ian Tomlinson, the newspaper vendor who collapsed and died after being struck by a police officer in the 2009 G20 summit. A pack of lies were fed by the police force to the Evening Standard, which has regurgitated it. 2005, of course, the killing of John Charles de Menendez, a series of police lies about the circumstances which led to his killing. I mean, just finally, look, the general, you just kind of touched on a lot of that, but the general authoritarian turn that is taking place across the Western world. In America, the United States, we saw pro-Palestine demos demonized, not just by people on the right, but people, again, who call themselves centrists and moderates. And now Trump's, he's got a proposed package of laws to suppress pro-Palestine demos. And anyone who thinks it will stop there, I think, again, they're going to collide with brutal reality. And that's the danger, isn't it? That you get attacks on civil liberties and demonization of protesters by those who call themselves centrists and moderates, and then that's used to help destroy democracy by the extremists who are currently, let's just be absolutely blunt about it, on the rise here and everywhere.
I mean, you've just articulated it really well, so there's not a huge amount to add to that. But I suppose let's look at who's prime minister at this time too. It is someone who is very comfortable, I think, with some of those authoritarian tactics, or at least the idea of gaining more power. We only need to look at Keir Starmer's attitude towards Jeremy Corbyn, his supposed friend, who he then could not dismiss quickly enough, and the way that he has managed the party. Now, I'm not comparing for a second the way you manage your own internal party factions with the need to manage a country in terms of protecting democracy. But you see the patterns exactly of how he operates and how he behaves. So we are in this incredibly dangerous moment. And again, to repeat the point, it's a moment that can't come quick enough for Nigel Farage, and all plays into exactly the things that he wants. And it also plays into the fact we have seen racist riots on our streets just last year. It feels like, I'm not including you in this, Owen, but more legacy media, it just feels like the idea that we had racist riots on the streets just isn't talked about. It was like some sort of this odd blip that happened last year. And then, admittedly, I was really pleased to see the people who turned out in Walthamstow, in Liverpool, in Manchester, the huge numbers on our streets. But the fact that there was solidarity does not mean that the riots did not happen in the first place. It does not mean that they were fueled by years of anti-migrant and anti-refugee rhetoric, and the same sort of rhetoric, again, that the Labour Party are engaging in. Do I believe the Labour Party are engaging in full-blown racist rhetoric? No, they're not. Do I believe that they're engaging in rhetoric about things like, you've lost control of the borders, Tories did not cut immigration fast enough, those kind of lines? Yes, I do believe in that. Is that one small step away from full-blown racist rhetoric? Yes, it is. In fact, it's a huge dog whistle. And I think all of these things are going on, and they're all playing into Labour playing short-term politics. They are playing with fire. They are playing with dangerous rhetoric that entirely fuels the far right. And that's exactly the place our country is going into at the moment. So I don't end on a particularly grim and depressing note. That's hard, increasingly hard not to end on these days. I do think the alternative is screaming out for change. I think the majority in this country reject that kind of politics. They reject that kind of toxicity. And we see in polling at the moment under the first past the post system how fractured all of this is, and it cannot continue. So the only thing we know will not remain is the status quo. So we're at this choice where we either fall and descend and we give into despair and we move into this increasingly far right authoritarian politics, or this is a moment for the left to say, we have the answers here. This is a moment where we can rebuild our country, where we can tackle the climate crisis, tackle racism, tackle inequality in our society. Let's talk about multimillionaires and billionaires who are profiting from what is going on in Palestine, from the war machine, who are profiting from the climate crisis, who are profiting from even the fires in LA, which are great for growth and GDP if you are the people who are profiting from certain things in there. So I think it's important all of those conversations happen. And I feel we've hit the point where we are near rock bottom and those conversations are happening. But of course, we've got to defend the most vulnerable in those conversations.
Amen. Thank goodness we've got Zack Polanski and other colleagues of his in the Green Party. Unlike, I'm afraid, a Labour leadership, which is paving the way ever more for terrible authoritarianism, as well as not fixing the problems in the country which lead people into, or drive people into the arms of Farageism.
And it's an important moment to say, Owen, well done, for more than well done. A huge congratulations on your contribution here. If it was not for your investigation into the BBC, then a lot of these conversations would not happen. But that was slam dunk evidence of what lots of people believed, but didn't necessarily have the information in the investigation. So that incredible work that you're doing is all feeding into this. And I think history will judge you very kindly indeed.
Oh, bless you. Well, on that note, we praised each other. But of course, just all I'd say is, you know, in my own view is the bar is on the floor with journalists in this country, in that there are so many. It's not the people who just support what Israel's doing. It's the people who still are silent. The people who refuse to speak out when they know what's happening is a horrible evil. And, you know, those of us who have a platform who've spoken out, you know, I just wish there was more focus on the people who refuse to, even though they can. Anyway, please like and subscribe. Leave your thoughts, your comments, because that's good for the algorithm, but also it's good to have your feedback. We want people to watch the video. Do share it. Get the message out. That's the whole point. But Zack, thanks so much as ever for your brilliant leadership. If we had more Zack Polanskis in British politics, then the country wouldn't be a burning skip. So thank you.
Thank you, Owen.